Okay, so you've gotten through the first 5 weeks of class already. Your first essay is done. Now we're in week 6, and this week we'll be talking about sociological research. So there are a few big takeaway points from Chapter 2, and the first is the debate over whether sociology is a science or not. It is certainly considered a social science, but I always find it hard to argue that sociology is a science in the same way that physics is. There are no laws of motion in the social world. However, the textbook argues that it is a science, and I'd love it if we could continue this debate on the discussion board. Whether you consider it a science or a hard science, sociology does follow a rigorous research design. I'm going to talk you through the steps of the research process along with examples from my own dissertation project so you get sort of an illustrated example. A researcher begins by figuring out what she wants to study, finding some interesting issue or problem in her social world. For my dissertation, I was interested in understanding how different groups of people experience living in a gentrified neighborhood. Then she reviews the literature in her field. I read dozens of books and journal articles about urban sociology, class, and gentrification. The next step is forming a hypothesis. I imagine that long-term residents might feel some nostalgia for their old neighborhood, even if they're happy with some of the changes in the new neighborhood, and that newer residents are more likely to be patronizing the new establishments of the area rather than the old ones. This is my hypothesis for my dissertation. Next, the sociologist designs a research plan. This consists of picking methods and sources for information. So I wanted my project to have mixed methods. So I include numerical data like census reports and statistics, as well as more in-depth information about interviews and ethnographies. The next step is actually carrying out the research. I'm currently interviewing residents and store owners in the neighborhood and doing an ethnography of public spaces, like parks and retail streets, to see how people act and interact. And I've also analyzed census data since 1970 to see how demographics have changed in the neighborhood over time. Next, the researcher gathers all of her data and interprets the results, meaning that she figures out what the data says about the issue or problem at hand. For example, one of my findings is that many Polish and Hispanic families have moved further into Brooklyn or Queens, suggesting some breakdown of the immigrant communities in Williamsburg. Finally, she reports her research findings, which is what I will do when I write up my dissertation. When we're discussing methods, it's important to understand the difference between quantitative and qualitative methods. In general, quantitative tend to include larger numbers of people, like statistics, census questionnaires, or surveys. Quantitative methods tend to give us information about a lot of people, but it doesn't go as in depth. Qualitative methods are usually more about depth than breadth. These include interviews, ethnographies, and participant observations. Now, these methods don't allow us to make too many generalizations, but they do give us a richer understanding of what people say and do. And you'll read more about each of these methods in your textbook. The textbook also deals with other important topics like being objective in the field versus reflecting on your subjectivities in your research. It's also important to understand the difference between causation and correlation. There's an old sociology joke or story about storks and babies. At one point in Amsterdam, a statistician noted that storks were likely to nest on top of the houses where newborn babies lived. So does this mean that the presence of storks causes more newborns? Of course not. There was merely a correlation between the two. Families with newborns tended to keep their homes warmer, and so the storks were more likely to rest on houses with warmer roofs. Thus, there was a correlation between the storks and the babies, but not a causation. For this week's e-portfolio, you're going to be doing some sociological research of your own. And that is, you'll be interpreting data that has already been collected. And there are directions in the weekly folder, but I'll go over it quickly here. So we're starting from the UN website that has statistical data that they've collected. So if you go down to the ePortfolio assignment, it's the UN-sponsored Millennium Development Goal Indicators. So what you do first is you hover your mouse over Indicators and click on Official List. Now this gives you an idea of the types of goals and indicators that the UN has proposed. So they want to look at eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, and these are the different targets. Universal primary education, promote gender equality, reduce child mortality, and so on. So read the goals and choose one that you would like to do. Now hover your mouse over Data and click on Country Level Data. Now first select which goal you wanted to look at. I was interested in education, so I choose Achieve Universal Primary Education. And then which measurement of that goal you want to look at. So if we click in here, there were all these different measurements of the goal. And I want to look at primary education completion, the percentage of children who complete their primary education for both sexes, boys and girls. Next, select the country that you'd like to get information about, and you're just going to select one. So I'm going to select Azerbaijan. Don't change anything in the third column here, and then just click View Data. So then you're going to review the chart and percentages that are presented over time. Now, if you do this and you only have maybe 1 or 2 numbers for your goal or your country, go back and either change the goal or change the country. That way you have a bit of data to interpret. Okay? So then you'll write up your information. And I ask you to tell me which country you chose, which goal and country you chose. What are some of the indicators of the goal? So look back on that official list and look at the indicators. And then what are the trends in that goal over time? And 1 to 3 sentences there. So this should really only be about a paragraph of write-up. So I chose to look at education in Azerbaijan using a measure of the percentage of children that completed their primary education, boys and girls. This would basically be how I would write this up. So for this, we see that they've collected data since 1993, and the rates have been fairly consistent over the time in the 90% range, except for in 1996. And you might even want to go back and look at the history of that country or what's going on when there's a dip like that. That might lead you into some sociological research, right? Okay, so that's it for week 6. You also have your discussion board, which will be discussing methods and also whether or not sociology is a science. I'm looking forward to that because it's always a fun conversation. Okay, have a great week.